Hi everyone, welcome to my channel. In today's video, I'm going to be showing you the basics of knitting that will help you to get started on making your first project right away. In this video, I'm going to teach you how to do a knit stitch, purl stitch, how to cast on, bind off, and finish your project, and I'm going to include some extra little tips that can help you in case you run into any trouble in your first project. With these basic stitches, I will show you how we can create 3 styles of washcloth based on these different combinations of stitches that will give you very different designs. I've included some timestamps in the description box below, so you can skip ahead to any part of this video or go back to it if you just need a little bit more time to learn some of these techniques. Anyway, let's get started. What you need for this project is a pair of stitch markers, some scissors, straight needles or circular needles of an appropriate size for your yarn, a darning needle, measuring tape or ruler, and some 100% cotton yarn. I'm using Lily Sugar and Cream in the colors Soft Ecru, Blue Jeans, and Robin's Egg. I've included links for them below. For the Garter Stitch washcloth, I decided to use the color Blue Jeans. Before you start a long tail cast on, a cool hack that you can do is wrap the yarn around the needle for the number of stitches you plan to cast on. For my washcloth, I need to cast on 56 stitches with a US size 8 straight needle. To begin a project, you need to start by getting some yarn onto the needle. There are many different ways to cast on for a project, but I will be showing you the long tail cast on for this project. You start with a slip knot by making a loop with the yarn, give it a little twist, and pick up the yarn below. Put it on the needle and secure it. Next, I like to keep my right index finger on top of the knot and holding the yarn in my left hand between my palm and my ring finger and pinky, I use my left thumb and index finger to dive in between the yarn and open it up like this. To pick up the yarn, take the tip of the needle and pick up the outermost strand, bring the needle up and over to the other side, and bring the needle through the other loop, and you'll see a loop form on your needle. Let go of the yarn wrapped around your thumb and pull the knot to the needle. Now you have 2 stitches on your needle, including the slip knot. I casted on 56 stitches. When you get to the end, turn your work around and get ready to start the first row of garter stitch. At this point, you're probably wondering, how do I even hold the needle and yarn in my hands? There are 2 main styles for holding your knitting needles in your hands. There's English style and Continental style. With English style, when you're making a knit stitch, the yarn is held in the right hand and the needles are in the left. You wrap the yarn around the needle with your right hand, grab the needle, pull through with the yarn towards you, and then take it off the needle, creating 1 knit stitch. Let me show you that a few more times. Insert the needle knitwise, wrap around, pull through and off the needle. Insert the needle, wrap around, pull through and off the needle. This knitting style is often used by beginners because it offers a little bit more control, but it's usually a lot slower than Continental because there's a lot more movement involved. With the Continental style, the yarn is held in the left hand and wrapped around your fingers to help you with your tension. Knit, wrap the yarn counterclockwise, bring the yarn towards you and off the needle. Again, knit, wrap the yarn, pull towards you, and off the needle. There are a lot less movements, and I find it a lot faster, and this is the style that I knit with. Garter stitch, you're going to knit every row back and forth. Once your piece is pretty much the size you want it, you can measure it to see how much more you need to go before it's done. I'm not going to get too technical with this, but since I want my washcloth to be a square, I'm just going to fold it in half and see if it's the right size. You can also use a tape measure to check the length and the width to see if your piece is a square. To bind off your project in the simplest way, make a knit stitch and then make a second knit stitch so that you have 2 stitches on your right needle. Now use your needle and pull the first stitch over the second stitch. You've just bound off 1 stitch. Now do the same for the next one. Knit the next stitch, pick up the first stitch over the second stitch and take it off the needle. Keep doing this until all the stitches are bound off. When you get to the last 2 stitches, you're going to do the same thing you did on the other stitches, pull over and off, and with the loop that's still on your needle, pull it up to create a tail and cut the end with scissors, leaving some yarn to weave in your ends. I'm going to weave it into the edge of my work and back up through the loops next to it a few times. There are many ways to weave in your ends, so just find what works for you. For the Stockinette Stitch washcloth, I'm using Robin's Egg Blue. And I switched to circular needles because I find them easier to work with than straight needles, even though we're working with a flat project. You can use the same wrapping method to figure out how much yarn to use for the long tail cast on, just like we did with the previous part. If you want to see that again, you can look for it in the timestamps below. After completing 3 rows of garter stitch, which will form the border around the stockinette center, it should look like this. The garter stitch border keeps the edges from rolling, which naturally happens with stockinette stitch. For the edges of the border, you are going to knit on both sides of the work for 3 stitches. To help keep track of your work, you can place a stitch marker after the first 3 stitches. This can be a scrap piece of yarn or an actual stitch marker. Then continue knitting across your work until just before the last 3 stitches. When you get to the last 3 stitches, place your second stitch marker and then knit the last 3 stitches. Turn your work around, and on the next row, you're going to knit the first 3 stitches for the border. Move the stitch marker to the right-handed needle. Bring the yarn to the front. Insert the needle through the front loop from right to left. Wrap the yarn counterclockwise and pull through and off the needle. To work this stitch in English style, take the yarn in your right hand, insert the needle from right to left in the front loops, wrap the yarn around, pull through and off the needle. Again, wrap the yarn, pull it through the needle, and off. One more time, we're going to wrap counterclockwise, pull it through, and off the needle. You can see that on the wrong side you've got bumps, and on the right side of the work it creates flat V's. Purl the rest of the way across your work until you reach the next stitch marker. Bring the yarn to the back and knit the last 3 stitches. Turn your work around, and on the right side of your work, knit the first 3 stitches until you reach the stitch marker. Move the stitch marker to the other needle. And since we're on the right side, we're going to knit to the other side until you reach the next stitch marker. When you get to the second stitch marker, move it to the right needle and then knit the last 3. You're going to keep alternating between the knit side and the purl side until you are ready to complete the border edge. Fixing a drop stitch in stockinette is similar to fixing one in garter stitch, but I personally find it easier. Knit to the stitch just before the drop stitch and locate the bars above that stitch. Insert the darning needle through the drop stitch and pick up the bar directly above it and pull it through the loop. Repeat the process for all of the bars above the drop stitch, just like the first one. The nice thing about stockinette stitch is that they're always pulled through on the same side of your work. Once you've got the last loop salvaged, you're going to take the loop that's on your darning needle and replace it back on the knitting needle on the left side, making sure that it's not twisted. And when it's done, you should have a nice flat knit stitch on the front, and your purl side on the back looks perfect. You can't even tell that there was a mistake. Once you're happy with the size of your piece, you have to complete the border. Since I finished on the right side, I want the next row to look like purl stitches to match the bottom border. To begin, I'm going to knit 3, remove the stitch marker, and then bring the yarn to the front and purl until I reach the other stitch marker. When you reach the second stitch marker, remove it, bring your yarn to the back, and knit the last 3 stitches. Turn your work around and repeat the same thing you did in the row before, and when you're done with that, bind off on the next row like we did for the garter stitch. And last but not least, the seed stitch. I'm using soft ecru for this one. Let me show you what this looks like. I'm sorry that it's a little bit out of frame, but what you're going to do is knit the first stitch with the yarn in the back, and then bring the yarn to the front and purl the next stitch, then bring the yarn to the back and knit. And then bring the yarn to the front and purl. Since I started with a knit stitch and I cast it on with an odd number of stitches, I wanted to end with a knit stitch to make the edges look symmetrical. To read your work, you want to knit over a purl stitch and purl over a knit stitch. Knit, purl, knit, purl, knit, and purl. So let me show you what this looks like. As you can see, I have a purl stitch, so I want to knit on top of it. And then my next stitch was a knit below it, so I'm going to purl on top. Bring the yarn to the back, and I'm going to knit over the purl stitch. Bring the yarn to the front, and then purl over the knit stitch. Knit over the purl stitch, and then purl over the knit stitch. After a few rows, this is what it looks like on both sides. Continue in this pattern until your piece reaches the size you want and bind off. I want to show you the importance of using the right size needle and yarn for your project. I cast on 56 for both, but they had different needle sizes. So this one was using a US 8 on the straight needles, and this was using a US 9 on the circular needles. As you can see, the light blue one is so much bigger than the dark blue one, and this is because the needles are just taking up more space, creating a looser knit fabric than this one. When I wanted to make the white cloth with the size US 9 circular needles, but I wanted it to match the size of the blue one that was done with the size 8 US needles, I cast on less for this one. So I cast on 51 stitches in comparison to 56, and just by doing that, now my two cloths are basically the same size. I really hope you liked this video, and if you did, please like and subscribe below because that will really help me to continue making some awesome content for you every Sunday. In my next video, I'll talk more about gauge and how you can knit your very first sweater even as a beginner. If you want to see that, please turn on the notifications so that you don't miss it. I hope to see you soon. Bye!